My name is John Barron. I'm a journalist with the ABC, presenter of ABC Fact Check, and also a research associate at the United States Studies Centre at the University of Sydney, where I teach a course in US media and politics. So this is just my bag, and I hope it is yours as well. And we will have time to take some questions a little bit later as well. But first, let me introduce our panel. First, my boss. How awkward is this? Kate Torney, Director of News at the ABC. I'm sure when she said she'd do the panel, she didn't know I was going to be facilitating it. Certainly when I was asked to do the panel, I didn't know. But I'm delighted. I'm delighted that Kate is here. So wish me luck. Next to Kate Torney, Director of News at the ABC, is Robert Schlesinger, who is the opinion editor at the US News and World Report, possibly of the three big sort of news weeklies, or as was News Weekly, now not weekly, and some critics say not news, but we'll get to that. Less well known.
I run opinion, so
right.
I'm immune to that.
Yeah, and we will talk about opinion as well in all of this, and the demand for opinion now over news, and some of the reasons for that as well. And Jane Newton-Small on my left, as you're looking at her, from Time magazine, another one of the big three. I guess there's almost a bit of a sense of this whole sort of forum is predicated on the notion that we've really been through a really interesting time in journalism in the United States and in Australia, and economically as well as journalistically, and the way that the technology has sort of flowed through this. The fact that it's been a very disruptive period in the United States, the media has changed, some organisations have gone out of business altogether. Others are looking for a new business model, and we have heard already today about the fact that this is a business issue to an extent. The old model, the rivers of gold, the classified ads, the advertising revenue is gone. But of course, for journalists, the reality of that is, well, there are half as many journalists at places like the Washington Post and the New York Times, Fairfax and others in Australia, cutting back on the number of reporters. And yet with the new media, the social media, the online presence, the demand is greater than ever. Less journalists doing a lot more. And one of the things that seems is listeners and viewers are being listened to more. What do they want? Maybe that's the answer to finding this business model, finding the way towards the future. So I'd like to start with a question to each of you briefly first about this last 5 years. First to you, Kate. The last 5 years, it has been a period of significant change, perhaps not as economically bad in this country as it has been, and being with a national broadcaster, you're not necessarily in touch with the same sort of commercial realities. But you've got to attract viewers and readers and listeners and fulfil a charter. So ratings, points, clicks, just as important for you as anyone else, really.
Absolutely, and I think for the ABC, as a broadcaster, if I think back 5 years and certainly 10 years, our role as news producers and in a television and radio sense was to determine what we thought was news and to present a bulletin in a very one-way relationship with our audience. So for us, the incredible change has been the relationship with the audience. And when we look back at that, it was a fairly arrogant relationship with our audience. It was us telling them what we felt was news and us expecting the audience to listen and digest that news. So for the broadcast news industry, I think that has been an absolute turnaround. All of a sudden, we have this immediate feedback, which I think for smart news organisations is just a gift. Suddenly, we understand that we have this dynamic relationship. We not only have access to our audience in terms of feedback and the kind of news that we're producing, but also this great source of news and information. And I think that's a massive change. The technology change has been enormous, but the cultural change for journalists has been significant. Yeah,
we'll talk about some of the ups and downs of that as well, and the challenges that it faces, and the shift in thinking for perhaps a lot of editors and journalists as well, to sort of say, is that really news? Should that be in the bulletin? Should that lead, etc.? But Robert, it has been a very interesting time for your publication, one of the big three. But in a way, you've been wrestling with this: where do we make money, and then, in a journalistic sense, what do we spend it on?
Right. I mean, when I started at US News 5 years ago, we were still a weekly news magazine, and we also had a website. And in fairly rapid, at a fairly rapid pace, in the last 5 years, we went from publishing a weekly news magazine to publishing a bi-weekly news magazine to publishing a monthly news magazine to just being a website, not publishing a regular news magazine at all. And it used to be, when I started, the kind of main metric that we had to know what interested our readers and what got them engaged about a specific issue was we could see how many issues were sold at the newsstand. And you have all the covers from recent issues on the wall with a little number of how many were sold. Now I can go back to my hotel room. I can see exactly how many people read my last column. I can see where they came from. I can, whether they came from search or whether they came from a website or whether they came from just the three people who are all related to me, who are fans of mine, and go straight to my column and read it. And it is as you say, it's a sea change in how we relate to our audience, and when we'll get into what that means in terms of how we decide what to cover.
Well, Jay, tell us, as a journalist who has spent a lot of time not just travelling and reporting around the United States, but around the world on your various beats, when you've got that sort of awareness back in the newsroom or in the management suite of, well, here are the stories that are going to get clicks, here are the stories that people are interested in, has there been a discernible effect at the coalface of the kinds of stories that you're going to get sent to? Do they say, oh, bring it back from Iran, that's no one's clicking on that?
Not so much that, that I don't, not discernibly for me. And mostly as a magazine journalist, I think we tend to find our own stories and generate our own stories. And we're lucky that, I'm lucky that Time sort of lets me, pitch my own things. I don't get a lot of dictates from down above saying do this story or do that story. But I really do sense a change in how Washington and how things have, how we cover things differently. And it's a very, more of a sideways look than a frontways look. So for example, I think 6-7 years ago, at the end of 2006, I was covering Hillary Clinton, who was going to run for president, and there was a phone call of announcing that she had sort of kept in $10 billion worth of cuts to Medicaid in the budget. And this was a triumphant phone call. And there were probably about 150 journalists on this call. And there was one journalist who had put down the phone and started, talking to a woman, and and we could all hear him on the line, and and the phone call got more and more sort of salacious, and we were like all kind of buzzing between each other, like, who's this guy? And Hillary comes on the line, and she's completely offended because she's having to talk over this guy who's really chatting up this woman quite in a dirty way, and it was getting rather embarrassing, I think, for everybody. And it was an amazing thing because, out of the 150 journalists, one person from New York Newsday stayed on the line and waited for the guy to finish the call, and then said immediately, "Who are you?" And it was a front page news story on Newsday saying, this Long Island sort of radio guy had completely interrupted Hillary Clinton's call, but the rest of us actually didn't pay attention to the call at all or to this interruption, and we just covered the $10 billion worth of cuts from Medicaid. And that today in Washington would be covered in a completely different way, because you have Politico, you have so much of a sideways look, The Town, even Game Change, written by one of my colleagues, Mark Halperin. It's much more gossipy, it's much more a look at inside the scenes, and we just tend to look at news in such different ways now. And so I think that's really changed a lot, and just in general of how we look at news and how we cover it.
There was a lot of talk in some of the earlier sessions about cat videos, and we learned, in fact, from Hal last time around that the dogs are more popular than cats. Seems to me that fish are the other big thing. One of the most popular stories on ABC Online in the last month. Did you see this? The blobby fish that looks like a grumpy old man? Incredibly popular as a story. Now, with something like that, Kate, do you see that as the cherry on the top? Is it the dessert that goes with the well-rounded meal? Is it where do you put those stories?
Tell me you didn't click on that.
Of course I did, and everybody was talking about it. That's the point, isn't it?
Look, I think the most important thing particularly for a national broadcaster, we have a very clear responsibility, and we must be relevant. So I think a lot of the feedback around some of our content over a number of years has been that, we're the most trusted news brand in Australia, but sometimes we can be worthy. It's terribly important that we're relevant. To remain valued by the community, we need to be relevant. That doesn't mean that we need to constantly be filling our online pages with that sort of content, but it's of interest. So just as you would shape a news bulletin 5 years ago go with light and shade. So you would do the same kind of thing when you're mapping out your online and your digital content. So I don't think it's one thing or another, but I don't think we can be so highbrow as to ignore stories that are of interest to a range of people.
So you'd argue that's a bit like the baby panda story that went after the weather in the old days.
And finally tonight, John.
The and finally story. Now, Robert, it's been interesting with your magazine that you've found a niche. You know, we get a lot of talk these days online about sort of the BuzzFeed top 10, and everyone's doing the top 10 puffy fish and everything else. But you've been doing lists that actually require journalistic work, a lot of research, and it's become an incredibly valuable, it's almost a new business for you.
Well, first I should say, I thought we were going to talk about Kevin Bacon, the stolen pig.
Ah, yes.
Not the fish, but, but no, I mean, U.S. News, I would not have a job. U.S. News and World Report would not exist anymore if, I don't remember the exact history, but if a decade or 2 or 3 ago someone hadn't said, you know, how about we rank colleges? How about we give people the list of what the best colleges are? And then that franchise has grown, and we have best colleges, we have best graduate schools, we have best law firms, we have best hospitals, we have best vacations, and you know that is the reason that we are still in existence. And then you know, news and in my case, opinion is you know, we're the tail along for the ride, and I thank God for it. But it is, I guess you'd say that's the substantive upside of the kind of listicle, you know, 10 cat videos phenomenon.
Yeah, it seems as well, Jay, that with you've spent a lot of time on campaign politics, that it's almost like the great value now in campaign politics is either in incredibly short form reports, 140 characters or less on Twitter during a debate, for instance, or the long analytical pieces that come out. Why do you think there has been this kind of divergence in, you know, to the sort of the ultra short and the sort of the in depth?
I mean, certainly for us, we see. I mean, people keep sort of saying that long format is dead, that it's never, that we can't sell it. And I would say to those critics, as Jim said yesterday, that the Atlantic is having some of the best years that they've had. We're actually, we've been hiring like gangbusters at a time, and we're actually having a good year too. And we've actually never lost money. And our number one edition that we sold this year was a 24,000-word story by Stephen Brill on Medicare, which you would never imagine that anybody would have that much interest in. And yet it was this huge hit online, and it was a huge hit in sales. And it really sort of showed us that there is still a huge appetite for this, and you can sort of monetize it successfully. And I think you add to that the Twitter world. I think Twitter, in some ways, Jay Rosen was talking earlier, I think maybe it was Jay Rosen or someone else, about how people treat online as like an advertisement. And I do think of Twitter as kind of like an advertisement, so you have like the headline of your stories that go by, and then you can follow it down the rabbit hole. And then the rabbit hole in our case is really long and big, and you can sort of read into it as much as you like. But I do think it's, in that sense, sort of this sort of almost like cubist 3D take on an event, which is really interesting in Twitter. But then also, you can go down so many different fun rabbit holes, and that's, to me, where the divergence has gone.
I think just following on from that point, a program like Four Corners is our equivalent to the long form. And the beauty about what that production team has been able to do is to acknowledge that, in fact, only a portion of that audience is going to sit down on a Monday night and watch that program. My 16-year-old, I couldn't pay her enough to sit with me on a Monday night and watch Four Corners, and yet that is a vital part of her news digest. But she has never sat and watched the schedule. She gets all of that through online and mobile, and it's often in segmented pieces. So I think understanding that there's an audience for your content in a range of different ways, and being smart enough to understand how to segment that content and make that attractive to a range of audiences. Now, my daughter often is brought back to that 45-minute program, but it's not through a schedule. So understanding the value of that, and the rabbit holes are really important, because sometimes they lead back to the longer form.
So the technology provides different ways of delivering to people when they want it, what they want, and so on. There's a process, though, of selection here. We're all becoming curators of our own information environment. Robert, when you're, I guess, when you're in the business of editing, that's something that you sort of, that's what you do. You make these judgments, you make these decisions. What are we going to run? When that's taken away from you, when people say, this is what I'm going to read, I'm going to take this, and you can see what they're doing, how does that affect your role?
Well, there's also implicit in that is the idea that people, that we, the editors or journalists, were once the gatekeepers, and now the people are the gatekeepers. And that's true in a sense, but we also have to keep in mind there's a third gatekeeper in play. Because when I want to find out about Kevin Bacon, the stolen pig, I don't necessarily go to the ABC's website or to the Sydney Herald's website. I go to Google and I type in Kevin Bacon, the stolen pig. And Google is deciding what the selection of stories that are available to me that I'm then making the decision from, or Yahoo. And Pew did a study a couple of years ago that looked at where news sites get their traffic. And they found that there were 3 sites that were the only sites that would send more than 10% of traffic to the major news sites. And it was Google, and it was Yahoo, and it was the Drudge Report. And Google and Yahoo, their algorithms work in their mysterious ways, and we're all trying to figure out how to crack that so we can get our story on the first page when people do their searches. But the Drudge Report has a specific point of view, and it has a specific kinds of stories that it wants. And I think that has an effect, both in terms of how things are assigned and, hey, can we get something on Drudge? But also, but then in a very different way, the fact that Google and Yahoo, we write headlines to try to do something better on Google. And I think it's important to keep in mind that there's sort of an invisible new set of gatekeepers in play here.
Jay, what do you think of the notion that says that if too much autonomy is given to the consumer, it's a little bit like the voters always getting their way through daily opinion polls, and that it leaves no room for leadership in politics or for news judgment in news organisations to actually say, look, you may not understand Syria, you may not be interested in Syria, but you probably should, so let me try and explain it to you. Let me try and give you some facts on this story.
I mean, I think every news organization will tell you that you're going to lose money on foreign news. We certainly do. And I remember covering, for example, the earthquake in Haiti, and we just knew it was going to be a total money hole. Like, we were not going to make any money off of doing a special edition on Haiti, but there are just some things you have to cover. I mean, they're just enormous, and they're such huge fundamental newsmakers that sort of change the way we look at things. You have to cover them, even if you know you're going to lose money doing so. But I do think that Washington is certainly an example of you can't really govern by crowdsourcing, and that is becoming increasingly, by popular demand. It feels like everybody is, making it doesn't feel like sort of the adults are in the room and making decisions anymore. It's like the crowd, the mob is running things, and to some degree, and not only in the journalism but also in the politics. I think almost especially in the politics. And I wrote a story 4 years ago called "Welcome to the Circus" in Time, and it was all about how politicians, had figured out that if they go to the floor of the House or the Senate and they say something incredibly bombastic, and then it goes viral online, and then they go on MSNBC or Fox, and then it doubles down, and they raise a money bomb of $1 million off of it, and that's sort of how they raise money these days. And that kind of crowd enraging and that kind of crowd sort of direction of news is becoming more and more popular and more likely in Washington, which is really disturbing.
You could argue it led Ted Cruz to filibuster and then lead the charge for a shutdown of the US government.
Yeah, exactly. And so you see that more and more. It's like the crowd, the mob is running the show, and it's sort of and you just wonder sometimes at some point living in Washington, when are the adults going to come back to the room and actually kind of run things? And to some degree, I think you could say the same about some, news sites and some editing, in the sense of you look at some websites and it's literally all crowdsourced and aggregated, and it's just whatever's most popular and whatever's most emailed, and whether if it's kitties or Kevin Bacon and his pig or whatever it is, and you don't see almost any hard news on some sites increasingly, and that is disturbing to me because I do feel like we're missing a strong editorial hand at times, both in Washington in terms of news and in terms of politics.
Kate, increasingly the foreign correspondent, instead of being sort of sent off to somewhere for 5 years to file sort of a story when a war starts after 2 years or something, and then you don't hear from them, it's more of a fly in, fly out model now. To what extent is that just because that's not nearly as expensive as putting somebody and their family in a jungle somewhere in case something happens? Or is that about the short attention span of audiences? They don't want somebody covering this one story. The war in Syria has been going on for 2.5 years. You don't want to put some person there. They can be going all over the place.
I'm not sure that I entirely agree with you about a fly-in, fly-out model. We've got 12 bureaus around the world. I've just come back from Beijing, where our correspondent has been there for 7 years. I certainly think that we've made significant and long-term investments. But cases like Syria, yeah, it's difficult, the story to tell. But I think if you had unlimited funds, of course, you would be investing long-term in those sorts of areas to be able to demonstrate and tell the story of that unfolding. That's not the case anymore. However, we have a Middle East bureau who have a speciality in that particular area. I think, in a way, being dynamic and agile enough to respond to the story is always incredibly challenging, and we'd love to have more money to pour into that flexibility internationally. But I think we've got a pretty big footprint and a fairly versatile footprint at the moment.
The decision, though, to even if you have an established bureau, when you know that there's a big story there, you're going to have demands from radio, TV, online, many platforms, so you'll perhaps send reinforcements.
Yes.
Is that based on judgments including the level of public interest in this story? I mean, is that feedback loop now with the news consumers informing those kinds of choices?
Look, to Jay's point before in relation to Haiti, there are stories that we know that we need to cover, and that we need to cover in a way that do make that story compelling to the audience. I remember having discussions a couple of years ago with some state editors who run our state newsrooms around commissioning of international stories. International makes up a huge component of our bulletins and our online presence, and ensuring that, in fact, the way we told those international stories was in fact relevant to their local audiences. And it was a really productive conversation, because it came back to telling those stories through people rather than the politics of a situation, really making sure that we were telling those stories in a way that was of interest to a broad audience, not just an audience who had a specific interest in foreign affairs.
Robert, yours is a last name and a bow tie that is associated with history and journalism in the United States. It seems that history has evolved from, once was the time, up until the middle of the 20th century, it was kind of, the way it was taught was all what great men said on great occasions and that kind of thing. And then it became more sort of, well, how the people felt about this and how it impacted real people's lives. Is that where we're going with more journalism now, that because we're now hearing what people are interested in, that which we might have thought was trivial or secondary, the colour, the movement, how this actually affects real people, is coming to the surface, or is that just sort of wishful thinking on my part?
I think there is an element of that. I mean, I think generally speaking, the great thing and also the downside about the current journalistic moment we're in is that the answer to virtually every question is yes. Is it better? Yes. Is it worse? Well, yes, it's that too. And so are we seeing more of that? Yes, we are, in good ways, and we're also seeing it in ways of, people, we get absorbed in people's trivialities on Twitter and talking about the Kardashians or what have you. So I think, we're in this moment where there's great possibilities and great possibilities for downside, and it's finding the right balance and finding the balance between, we're going to pursue the story not because we think it's a particularly good story. We're going to have some of the speed not because we think there's great intrinsic value in it, but you know what? People want to read about it, and so we have an obligation either to our investors or to ourselves in staying profitable to cover it. But at the same time, Haiti's an incredibly important story, and we're going to cover it even though we don't think that it's going to have that same kind of palpable return. But I think a lot of us in journalism, we certainly didn't go into it to get rich, right? I mean, we went into it because we think that there is an important role for it, and there's a greater good to be fulfilled. And to the extent we can, and to the extent the current situation allows us to, we try to do that. We try to find that balance.
Jay, you gave us that great story about the conference call during Hillary's campaign. The most recent presidential campaign in the United States, it seemed to be characterised by gaffes. Gaffes that were often sort of very quickly tweeted out by journalists sort of in the bubble and sent out, and this was suddenly a talking point on cable news within 10 minutes. You know, Rick Perry said this or whatever it might be. Right. Well, what's your thought on this? Because we've had a lot of discussions so far today about sort of the relative merits of, you know, what is important news, what is not. With something like Rick Perry forgetting the third division of government
he'd like
he's
to
going to
cut,
get rid of, yeah, and then not thinking of it. And I mean, does that actually tell more voters more things about this candidate than his policy on border protection, for instance, or Medicare?
Actually, instead of taking Rick Perry as an example, I'm going to turn it a little bit. And I covered the Boston bombing, and I was, you know, I literally drove into the shootout with Tamerlan Tsarnaev, and I was, you know, all night in Watertown with the police, and it was amazing to me the number of notes I got from people on my desk, you know, saying, well, Reddit is saying it's this brown college student, and, you know, Reddit is saying this, and we're hearing from readers that, and just the way that, and I wasn't watching CNN at the time, but my understanding is that, you know, the cable nets all night long were really driven by, I mean, essentially mass audience rumors, you know, and that to me is really dangerous for news because, you know, and my editors were saying, at least one of my editors was at one point saying, well, maybe we should include this in the story. And I was like, look, I'm only going to report what I see in front of me. And I'm not going to report like anybody's rumors or anybody's, you know, speculation because that's very dangerous. And it might not, you know, get us clicks because it might not be the breaking news story that, you know, that everybody's flocking to. But in the end, I think that, and I'm a conservative journalist in that sense, I think you can only really report what you know, and you have to really watch, you know, when people are trying to sort of, you know, especially in this day and age, what the audience wants is often not right.
And in that specific case, there were specific individuals who were identified as online people in good faith trying to help out, but there were specific individuals who were then in a real sense endangered because they didn't have anything to do with it, but they were, you know, thanks to crowdsourcing, they were identified. And I think that's exactly right. I mean, it's dangerous and it's irresponsible. As
a director of a news organisation, Kate Torney, this is a classic case of new media and old media colliding. Yeah. New media, you know, having so much information, not all of it good.
I thought that was a real moment for journalism, and the way that played out for us. Was that our news gathering desk, like news gathering desks around the world, were faced with, you know, just this avalanche of information, and our broadcast competitors, our 6 p.m. television bulletins, most of whom went with incorrect information, and we go to air at 7 o'clock. And so for that news gathering desk, it was a really interesting time. We had lots of discussion around the information that was available, lots of information around how we treated that information without ignoring it completely, but how we kind of just reverted to first principles without being able to verify the information. We weren't prepared to run with that information, and yet, you know, the pressure of seeing reputable news organisations as well as trusted social media sources report that information. It was an interesting moment, but yet, you know, again, if you return to your first principles, and for the ABC, you know, trust is absolutely everything. And for me, it was a moment, and a moment of great pride, because not one EP or state editor called me to argue the case about running that information. And I'm so proud to run a news organisation where that is just not an issue. You know, the need to maintain and nurture the trust in the audience is terribly important.
Is it hard to resist, though, that correction culture, the never wrong for long approach to website journalism, if they are your competitors?
No, it's not, because the value of a trusted news brand is so important, and that is in the DNA of the journalists who work at the ABC. So The not wrong for long philosophy is simply not part of what we do. I would much prefer to be right than to be first. And yes, there's a pressure, but to watch that newsroom on that particular night and to know that we were all standing together, possibly being absolutely creamed on that story, but quite comfortable that we had particular values that we weren't prepared to compromise. I think that's important, and in a way, it simplifies things. If you know where your line in the sand is, and you know what your values are, and you know what your first principles are, and that they are absolutely part of the DNA of your organisation, then I think that simplifies a terribly complex environment.
Robert, the Boston bombing is an interesting example because, in a way, it was a made-for-media event.
Right.
The bombing at the finish line of a marathon, when there are cameras on it, it was immediately carried live on cable news. They're getting all this information. It played out over the course of that week, including the chase and everything, almost like binge watching a box set of Homeland. And it all happened in this time. There's tremendous pressure to sort of say, who are the bad guys, find them, etc. What if the audience says, you know what, I don't mind a bit of bad information. We get fake leads in Homeland all the time. Yes, he's on our side. No, he's not on our side. If people actually want to say, look, don't tell me what's good or bad information. Just give me the information. I can decide.
And I think it's worth noting that it's not just the Boston bombing. I mean, it was. I remember on 9/11 running down to the Washington Mall because there were fires in the mall, and then there was a bomb at the State Department. And it goes through the Boston bombing. It goes to the TSA shooting on Friday, where someone tweeted out that the former head of the NSA had been shot in the shooting and was dead. Mm-hmm. And one of the British papers picked that up and reported that. I guess in this expanding media universe, there will be places that are willing to do that, and if people want to go to that, that's their business. I think that self-consciously responsible news organizations should be responsible, and I think that you could watch watch any of the CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, and any of these breaking news moments where there's a big thing going on. Now they kind of pat themselves on the back because they don't actually report the rumor, but they say, what we're hearing, and we haven't confirmed this yet, so it may not be true, but what we're hearing is that X and Y and Z happened. And that's great that you're couching it that way, but it's still kind of a cop-out because if you're a self-consciously serious news organization, you should go to have those first principles and not do the cop-out and say, you know what, we're gonna report facts as we have them. And we're gonna leave the rumors big.
And I think I think there's a kind of arrogance in not acknowledging where your audience is. So for us, it was absolutely a matter of saying the facts that we have available. This is the information that we know. We know that there's a range of other pieces of information out there, but I think you can't kind of roll it back for the audience. You know that your audience has a range of access to other information, but I think having the confidence to know where your line in the sand is important.
And it's also dangerous sometimes to sort of go down these paths where I'm just trying to think of, for example, when the Capitol was on lockdown and there was that woman who'd driven her car in and there were all these rumors that senators had been killed and people had died and you report something like that and it can be quite dangerous. I mean, the outcomes of, they'll evacuate entire buildings in the Capitol based off of news reports, essentially. It's so, and that can cause panic. It could cause somebody to get trampled. I mean, you have to just be so careful these days in the way that your news is disseminated and making sure that you are responsible with delivering, I think, the facts.
I thought it was quite interesting, though, Boston, just in the way that social media reacted to that as well. I think you kind of saw a sense of responsibility within Twitter users and Reddit users once, in fact, there was an understanding of the danger of misinformation. And I think we're seeing more of that. I just think we're seeing a more responsible kind of collective response to that.
So, to sum up for each of you, from your own perspectives, you talk, Kate, about your organisation becoming more responsive and perhaps sort of less sort of judgmental, distant, and sort of say, and thee shall read the news as I hand it down in these tablets of stone. And yet there's also this sense that there is a professional responsibility that the people in these jobs have to make these well-informed decisions about is it now right to put this information out there, and to not be pressured into doing that if you haven't got the two sources independently confirming it, or whatever your rule of thumb is.
I think too it's this wonderful capacity now to let a story evolve and to ensure that we've got a partnership with the audience in telling that story as it evolves as well. The role of news organisations now in trying to make sense of the mountain of information, but in doing so with the audience and having that partnership is terribly important. I think our user-generated content. I started as a talkback radio producer, and in a way you had that similar engagement with the audience, and it was an ongoing engagement and immediate feedback. It's sort of an extension of that, but the value to us as journalists, and I think to us as editorial leaders, is extraordinary.
And Robert, in your instance, you've got a brand that is still powerful and credible, even to shift it into a new area of information. Do you envisage that shift is going to change? How's the relationship with the audience going to be? What are you going to be providing for them of value?
What do you mean by the shift into the new area of
when it came to your
technology, or
and also in terms of the subject matter that you're doing with your publication, providing the kind of the lists, the analysis, these sorts of things. We're seeing organisations now that are going into sort of infographics and finding new ways of providing information that may not be in the 24,000-word story.
Right, and it's this is an ongoing discussion that we have in our organisation. I'm sure you do, and I'm sure you do. Of again, how do we find this balance, and how do we use the tools that are now available to us, whether it's through infographics or through greater and thinking about how to engage the audience, and how to whether it's through SEO and getting them through Google or going through greater social sharing and sort of penetrating the social circles in Facebook, as the previous panel talked about. I could give you a question, or I could give you the answer I give would probably be different from the one 6 months from now, and we can come back a year from now, and the landscape is totally changing, and that's part of the thrill, and also part of the kind of heart palpitation causing nature of the current media era.
Yeah, Jay, yours, I guess, is the kind of career that most journalism students dream of when they sort of think of being that reporter that gets to go to trouble spots or to follow the big events, to be there as history is happening, whether it's a speech from Barack Obama when he's announcing his improbable run for the presidency and so on, right through to Boston. Do you see that as being a career that will endure for 20 years, 30 years from now, or is this the end of that?
I hope so. I mean, look, I think to me, I'm maybe because I am the one that goes and covers these things, but I think it's so important to have people on the ground, and I think it's so important to have journalists, there, physically there, witnessing these things and actually covering these things like Boston, and not like sitting in a dark room, like comparing photos of students who might or might not be these bombers, you know what I mean? And I think it's in getting that firsthand news, getting that firsthand sense, I think is absolutely crucial to the news, and being able to not just report, the most immediate reports, but also to do long-term analysis of this stuff. When I'm writing a story for Time, like for the Oklahoma tornadoes, for example, I'm writing the online sort of stories, which will go immediately, like right away, and then a larger cover, which will be sort of 5,000 words, which does a huge analysis of, with other people, obviously, there's a group of us banding together to write, a big cover about, that's 5,000 words about what this tornado means and whether early warning systems, are effective and things like that. So, I mean, I think I really do hope that the future of journalism involves, people, who are on the ground, who can see these things for themselves, because I think that is the true value of journalism. And
I also think that, not to pump up our profession too much, but I think what journalism is gets undersold and underestimated. And I think there's a tendency among some people to say, oh, well, I can write down what the president says, and I can sort of do the transcribing thing, so I can
To
be
be
a
fair, there's a
journalist
lot of
too.
stenography in the White
Well,
House
and
press corps.
there is a lot of stenography in the White House press corps, and there's a lot of stenography in journalism, but the kind of journalism that you're talking about requires experience, and whether it's covering disasters or breaking news or covering the White House, covering Congress, and having the experience and the sense to be able to say, well, wait a second, that doesn't sound right, and we don't know, you don't have to go to school or get a degree to be a journalist. I mean, you can, but the best way to become a journalist is to go be a journalist. And so I think, in a sense, we're not doctors. We're not seen as having these specialized skills, but I think we do have these specialized skills, and it's hopefully something people will keep paying for.
Another one of the things that it seems audiences are demanding, they're certainly getting it in US media, is not just what happened today, but what should I think about what happened today? Make it quick for me. Don't just give me the raw data. Chew it up a little bit, and I'll decide what I think about this as well. For you, Kate Torney, your organisation is one that is required not to have opinion. How do you compete when you've got people that are already providing a semi-digested product here?
Yes. I think the value of journalism has always been social capital, so having the capacity to engage in a conversation about social events and the things that are happening around you. Our role as a national broadcaster is quite different to the role of other news organisations. So it's making sense of what's happened today. What does that particular news event mean, and where might that be heading? So it's really making sense of what has happened rather than
Context
any sort of
and analysis rather than
responsibility.
opinion.
Yeah, that's right.
Robert, in the United States now, people do talk a lot about the kind of ideological cul-de-sacs that people are now living in, because they do choose which magazine, which radio station, which cable channel they're going to... And there's this echo and amplifying effect. Is that just because people are competing in an open market and they're entitled to choose country music over folk music if they want to, or is there a concern there?
I think there is a concern. I think especially if you look at what's happened to the Republican Party, and I'm a progressive, so you can take my point of view as from where it comes from, but the GOP has got this kind of media industrial complex going on, where their base partisans watch Fox News, and they listen to Rush Limbaugh, and they read RedState.com, and they think that, the government shutdown could somehow have led to repealing of Obamacare. Or they think in late October 2012, or the first days of November 2012, Mitt Romney's going to win. I saw Dick Morris on Fox News tell me so the momentum is on our side. And I'm of the opinion that it is better to have some sort of shared reality rather than being able to just completely disassociate yourself and live entirely in the world of your preference.
And Jay, are you confident being able to keep the wolves of opinion from the door, that the pressure to sort of to take a slant on a story, tell people what to think is going to increase?
Certainly it has already increased. Washington has changed enormously. I wrote an op-ed for the Washington Post in 2007, which talked about how the Associated Press had decided they were going to stop doing, well, not stop doing, but in addition to doing sort of straight news, they started to do analyses, quote unquote, but those led to stories with headlines from the AP like, "I miss Hillary." And they were totally opinion pieces. And it was, to me, and I'm a former Wire reporter, I should say, so it was sacrosanct. The whole AP, to me, should be, really just straightforward news. Give me your facts, and that's really all I want from the AP. And it really bummed me out, like that, that they were sort of joining the bandwagon of Washington opinionating. Look, we're always going to have analyses. Like at the end of the day, we're living through these stuff, and and we will come to an opinion or some sort of judgment of like what happened and share it. But I think there's a really big distinction between that and sort of coming to it with a preformed opinion, and then pre-selecting your facts and ideas, and then presenting that in a way that bolsters your case. And I think it's a tough struggle in Washington and elsewhere to try and balance those out.
Now, that bell means either it's time to take questions or that Tinkerbell's alive. I'm not sure which one it is. But let's go with the questions thing. So we have the microphone here, and if you could keep them relatively concise, we'll try and get through as many questions as possible.
Apparently nobody has any.
Well, I guess we answered all questions.
No questions at all.
This is the first panel today that we've just gotten everything exactly right.
Well, that's most gratifying. Well, that's terrific. If we can perhaps wrap up with the panel to talk about, at the end of this process, has anything greatly changed in this period that we feel as though the business model has changed, the technology has changed, we're consuming media differently, the relationship with audience has changed, and yet some would say, Kate Torney, well, we've always had circulation figures, we've always had ratings points, we've always had ways of measuring. It's just now we can find out faster whether they like our stuff or not. You know, do you feel as though there's been a dramatic shift?
I do, and for an organisation like the ABC, the dramatic shift is that suddenly we have access to audiences who might not previously have tuned in to our content. So all of a sudden, this opportunity for the audience to share content is fantastic for a place like the ABC. So, you know, that's making us want to ensure that our content is relevant to broader audiences. We have a responsibility to deliver news to broad audiences. So this opportunity is just enormous for us, and so understanding how that's working, understanding the metrics around that, terribly important. Our traditional metrics are important, so the number of people who tune in to us on the schedule is important. But I think that for journalism, finding new metrics is important as well. So the impact of a story, beyond the number of people who tune into the schedule, the impact of a particular story and understanding how we can measure that will be important for journalism generally.
And Robert, in your case, I imagine there's sort of greater uncertainty in the US media landscape than in sort of the publicly funded media sector in Australia.
Oh yeah, no, I mean, and again, you have to find that balance of the bottom line and doing what the stories that should be done. But it's, you know, these metrics and social share and all these things are tools, and the question is on a organization by organization basis, as well as sort of norms of the industry, how do we use those tools? And is it simply, we're going to chase page views, and if that means kitty videos or dog videos, because I guess that's the popular thing, then it'll be dog videos. And if that means watching Google News and seeing what's trending, or chasing the Drudge Report, then we're going to do that. Or do you say, I guess the other extreme would be we're going to ignore traffic and do what we think is best and you know, hope for the best. But that's something that all of our organizations are struggling with, and as I said, we'll continue to, and we can check back every year for the next decade and see where we all are.
And do you think, Jay, that the level of public engagement, we talk about social media in the Arab Spring and so on, that this is changing the news as it's happening, as well as changing the way it's being reported?
I do, and like I said earlier, I think of Twitter as like a cubism. You know what I mean? Like, you know how you look at a cubist painting and it's meant a 2D representation of a 3D event, and I look at Twitter kind of like that, where especially for breaking news events like the Arab Spring, or, you know, what's going on in Cairo and Tahrir Square, or, you know, even the Green Movement in Iran, and you really get this amazingly unique view of the news, and that's really so new and so interesting. So you can not only see, you know, what the news take is of it for Time Magazine or for U.S. News and World Report or for the ABC, but you can also see what people on the street are saying and what people, you know, who are witnessing it are saying, and that's so valuable, I think, and so interesting to see. And so I think that is really changing, certainly, the way we do journalism, and it's become a major resource for us. And you know, I think it's much more interactive. You know, being able to tweet at activists, where are you? What's going on? Tell us. Like, and then reporting what they're tweeting. You know, and that's cool.
Yeah, well, it's a nice positive note to end on as well. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please thank our panel? Oh, we have a question. Oh, gee, what's the question?
Hi, thanks. My question is that given in the age of instantaneous news, there's a perverse incentive sometimes to report on stories based on rumours. And given that, as we heard, this can even be dangerous, do you think that there is a need for stronger media regulation?
Kate?
No. Look, again, coming back to Boston, there's no need for stronger media regulation when you're dealing with a story like that. There's absolutely a need for a very clear editorial leadership and a commitment to the principles of good journalism. That's nothing to do with media regulation. That's about I suppose, the integrity of the news brand.
They do talk in the United States about bringing back the fairness doctrine, and trying to make it a part of your licence conditions to be actually fair and balanced rather than, quote, fair and balanced and so on. Do you think there is a greater role for regulation in the United States, Rob?
I don't think at this point. I think that there is a role for, as you say, as Kate says, leadership. I think there's a role for criticism. And there's a role for going back after a Boston and saying, hey, wait a second, media, you got this, and this. I mean, sort of on a rolling basis, almost everything that was initially reported was wrong. And there's a role for trying to get self-correction. But we have, in the United States, we have the First Amendment, and freedom of the press is quite sacrosanct. And I'm very leery of legal ways of trying to, even with the best of intentions, trying to interfere with it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think any journalist wants to be regulated more or wants more rules about how we do anything. And and if you bring back the fairness doctrine, it's. I mean, who's going to say what's fair? The government, and that's not cool either. I mean, I don't know that I trust them to figure out what's fair any more than I trust Reddit or my editors or anybody else. I think it's all so subjective, and I think it's just a learning process, and the way that we're covering the news is just changing so quickly that we're all still trying to get our footing in this shifting sand and figure out how to do it best and not sort of screw it up too much.
And I think what you saw after Boston too was with whether it was news organisations or social media sites, really going through a process of self-reflection and very public commentary about what they got right and wrong. And that's probably the best form of regulation that we could hope for.
All right. Well, thank you very much for your question. Any more questions? All right, then. There's the bell. All right. Well, thank you all very much. It's been a pleasure to have you all here. We thank our guests, Jane Newton-Small, Robert Schlesinger and Kate Torney.